In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Benitoite. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a very dull blue-black that leans kind of gray. While it does shade decent enough, it somehow doesn't seem to really add much character to the writing. It's just kind of there. Also, as a blue-black, it tends to be much more blue-leaning than I would really prefer. In fact, I wasn't 100% sure, and I had to go reference some things because I felt really confident that this was more of a blue with gray than it was blue-black. Very surprising and really kind of a letdown. Now, with that, Lamy inks haven't always really been something I've gone for, so I may have a bias against them, I guess. Or maybe the brand just does nothing for me with their inks as a majority. Either case, I find that I'm happy I had the sample to know that I don't want a bottle. I really do think it's not bad. It's just bad for me. Now, it can darken up as a tone depending on the pen that you use it with. And if you go after a much darker tone with this ink, it starts to look much better than what you see in a lot of the writing, especially the writing here in my notes where it's much lighter, or even the writing that I did on the pen review. It's much lighter than I would prefer. Not something I want to have to look back towards. So just something to consider. You know, you have to be able to look back on your writing and say, yes, I like this. And this ink just doesn't do that for me. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pilot Vanishing Point with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it has no feather, no spread. It does shade in a few spots. You see it in Arrogant, you see it in That, and in Has. It's just kind of there. It's not great. The shading's good. It's just not doing it with this tone of the ink. Now, the medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, much more shading than we got with the fine, but the shading here I think looks a little bit better in how it's accenting the writing on the page. Better, still not for me, but much better. The broad is a little bit darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, still the same amount of shading that we got in the medium, so I won't call it anything bad. It's just certainly not for me. We get much more of the very dark and dark as far as that shading goes, though. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get almost no ghosting and no bleeding. To have a range of experience, all of the writing samples are done with a Kaweco brass sport with a fine nib, a Pelican P200 with a medium nib, a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. The fine nib has no feather, no spread. It does have some light shading. The tone of this ink is weird on this cream paper. I don't know. It looks a little odd as a blue-black for me. It even looks odd as a blue. Now the medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. The shading, I think, looks its best right here on this paper. The medium nib on this particular paper, I think the shading is at its best. Still, not being very interesting to me to look at, but it is its best. Now the broad nib is about the same tone as the medium with no feathering, no spread, only a few moments of shading going on. It really is just a dusty blue here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very little ghosting and no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, some light shading that's going on. The tone itself is just too light for me from a fine. I'm going to go ahead and take this moment to point out something that's gone on with the fine nibs with this ink. I have found that both the Pilot and the Kaweco have a tendency to hard start with this ink. I'm not getting it so much with the medium or broad, but I think it's something to be aware of on your dry fines that this ink may have a little bit of a performance issue. The medium is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, some decent shading throughout. It's not too bad. I think the tone of the paper is really helping it out here. Now, the broad is a little bit lighter than the medium. Now, I'm going to say a little bit lighter because most all of the writing is the lighter tone from the medium. So that's the reason I'm going to call it, where otherwise it's very similar. Now, it has a couple of moments of shading, not very much. The S in Father's has a little bit, the S in His has some, the K in Took, but not a lot, nothing stand out. Looking at the back of the page, we get minor ghosting and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, almost no shading, a very, very light tone. I would not be happy taking my notes in this ink on this paper because of the light tone. I find that when I take notes for things, that my notes, I really want to be a bit more standout and easy to read. I think a lot of notes like this might be a little more work for your eyes than you would like. Now the medium is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It does shade some. I see this tone being very usable for note taking. It's not too bad. It just looks like a lighter blue. The broad is a little bit darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, a few moments of shading that are happening. It's not too bad. I think this is your best case scenario, is a wetter broad nib on this paper for note taking. Looking at the back of the page, we get very minor ghosting and no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 8. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Midnight Blue. Here is Mont Blanc Midnight Blue, the Iron Gall version. Here is Sailor Blue Black. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, almost no shading. The blue is a little bit darker a tone than we've seen on some of the other papers, so I don't see this as being horrible with a drier fine on this paper. Now, the medium is a bit darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It does shade, I think, fairly well. You see a lot of dark spots peppered throughout the writing. The broad nib is a little darker than the medium with no feather, no spread. Yes, it is still giving shading, which is always good to have happen on your inexpensive papers. I think this is a really good ink to use on the cheap notebook papers because I would say it's fairly good. While the tone itself isn't something I necessarily want to run to, its performance, I think, is very good for students on this type of paper, especially here in the US. Now looking at the back of the page, we see very minor ghosting, excellent performance as that goes, and no bleed through whatsoever. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a magenta ink by Diamine Merlot. Here's an orange ink by Jehurban, their Orange Indian. Here is a red ink by Noodlers, their Dragon's Napalm. Here is a pink ink by Zenzoi, their Pink. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The fine nib has tiny feathers, really nothing to have any concern over, but there are some tiny feathers. You can see it in the word proceeding a bunch, but not so much in the word whole or and or released. So I want to say that this ink is performing exceedingly well on 20-pound copy paper. It has no spread. It has no shading. The medium has feathers, very consistent tiny feathers, but this is also very cheap paper. It has a tiny bit of spread, but really very little, not something that should be what stops you from using this ink on this paper. I really think this ink is doing very good on the cheap papers. It doesn't have any kind of shading. The tone itself is only a tad bit darker than what we see in the fine. But again, I think the performance here is really good with this paper. The broad nib has tiny feathers, just as the medium. It has a tiny bit of spread, but nothing to be a concern, just like the medium did. It has no shading, which is from the paper more than the ink. When we look at the back of the page, we see that it never came through and touched the page underneath, so no bleeding, which is fantastic. Now, we do see on the medium and the broad where it gets deeper into the paper but not through, but the fine nib, you could use the back of the page with a fine nib with this ink. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? If you like a duller, lighter, dusty tone, then this is a really good ink for you to go with a dry fine or dry medium. I think you would be able to be very happy with what you get. But if you want a darker tone, then you need to go with a very wet medium or broad pen. Now, I think it depends also largely with what paper you're writing with. While the tone that I got on the cheap paper on the fine nibs was not the tone I'm happiest with, its performance was truly fantastic, which means if I was a student, even though the color isn't perfect for me, its performance on the paper given is great. This may be an ink, even though it's not my favorite, that I'll consider a bottle of just to keep at school for students while I'm writing on their cheaper paper. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.